Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Andrew Calick, a member of City Club's program board. For more than a century, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people have come together to find solutions to our region's biggest challenges. We're gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel and are joined by thousands of people via X-Ray.FM's radio stations at 107.1 and 91.1 FM, KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app, and Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for all the work they do to bring Friday Forum to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our sponsors, volunteers, and staff enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank AARP Oregon, Avangrid Renewables, and SEIU 49 for their generous support of this and all of our Friday Forums this fall. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. Today, we are here to talk about groceries and whether they deserve a place in Oregon's Constitution. The proponents of Measure 103 declined to participate in a debate, so joining us to discuss Measure 103 are three opponents of the measure. Barbara Smith Warner, the state representative for Oregon House District 45, which includes Northeast Portland, the City of Maywood Park, and the Parkrose area. Representative Smith Warner is the House co-chair of the Joint Committee on Student Success, House co-chair of the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Education, and serves on the House Revenue and House Rules Committees. Also with us today is Christina Bodemer, Oregon Government Relations Director for the American Heart Association. Ms. Bodemer has worked for 10 years in government affairs for healthcare nonprofits, including the Oregon Dental Association and the American Lung Association. Rounding out our panel is Elizabeth Swartow, campaign manager for the No on Measure 103 campaign. Ms. Swartow got her start in Senator Michael Dembrow's legislative office and more recently managed Senator-elect Shemia Fagan's successful primary campaign. Moderating our discussion today is Hillary Borrud, the state government and politics reporter for the Oregonian. Hillary has covered local and state government for about a decade for publications including the East Oregonian, the Portland Tribune, and other community newspapers across the state. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. I'm Hillary Borrud from the Oregonian, and certainly would like to just jump in here with a little bit of background on how we got here. So how did Measure 103 wind up on the ballot? The initiative would ban taxes on food and soda, and although it's described in the ballot title as groceries, it does cover restaurant meals according to Oregon Department of Justice. Its supporters, which are mostly the grocery industry, have been clear that they wanted to bring this before voters this fall because of Measure 97 2 years ago and how expensive it was for them to put on a campaign to defeat the gross receipts tax. They'd spent around $7 million on that. And Measure 97, everyone probably remembers, would have raised about $3 billion a year for the state budget through a tax on sales. It would have been a tax charge to the companies, but it was based on sales of goods and services, including food. So then last year, advocates of taxing soda and other sugary drinks looked at asking voters to pass a soda tax in Multnomah County, and that didn't end up going forward, but it was probably another warning sign to beverage companies that prompted them to get involved in Measure 103 as well. So on the no side, of course, there's a long list of organizations at this point that we'll go into a little bit more. They include notably Nike, everyone's probably heard by now, and some of the state's largest public employee unions, environmental groups, and others that advocate on a wide range of issues. So I'm going to start out with a question for Elizabeth Swartow, and she again is the campaign manager for No on Measure 103. And so I'm wondering, you represent this campaign. Can you tell us a little bit about the makeup of the campaign, both its sponsors and its funders?
My pleasure. So we've been able to bring together a very broad coalition to oppose Measure 103. We have AARP, League of Women Voters, Partners for a Hungry-Free Oregon, the American Heart Association, City Club, as well as grocers, small businesses from across the state, and Oregon-grown businesses like Nike, like Cloudability. And I think that really speaks to the fact that we as Oregonians know that we have to be very careful when we change our constitution, and particularly looking at Measure 103. For one thing, it's unnecessary. We don't have a tax on groceries, and nobody is proposing one, and this particular policy is very, very flawed. And I think, again, the coalition really speaks to those points.
Okay, and we are also curious to know a little bit about how you're reaching out to voters on this topic. And just from a political reporter's standpoint, taxing food, especially in Oregon, is fairly controversial.
Well, again, I would say we're really leaning on our broad coalition that's from across the state and going out there and talking to voters. And I would also say, you know, this is not an argument about whether or not we're going to tax groceries. This is an argument about whether or not we're going to put this deeply flawed, confusing, and misleading constitutional amendment into Oregon's constitution permanently.
Okay, thanks. So now I'd like to find out a little bit more from Christina Bodemer, and she again is the Oregon Government Relations Director for the American Heart Association. And Christina, the American Heart Association isn't known for getting involved in state ballot measures, at least in the recent history that I remember. So why is it, can you tell us, that the AHA joined the campaign against Measure 103?
So for us, 103 is actually about kind of a little less understood part of the ballot initiative, and it is around local control. It's a concept called preemption, which removes local control from local county and city governments from being able to discuss public health policies for the better of their communities. These local elected officials know what's needed in their communities and how to affect change for individuals better than anyone. And what 103's language does is sets a standard statewide that removes important public health policy work that can be in communities from being able to be discussed. And it's not the first time. This is unfortunately a very common tactic to thwart public health. 40 years ago, when we started seeing a lot of great work around clean indoor air to protect people from tobacco industry came in and passed statewide preemption laws that prevented local communities from being able to protect themselves from the harms of tobacco at a local level to address this, and it took us until 2009 to be able to have a comprehensive Clean Indoor Air Act around the state. So as a blanket policy, preemption is not good for public health. It sets a dangerous precedent to remove power from local officials when a lot of the best public health policies actually start at a local level where important dialogue can occur.
Okay. Representative Barbara Smith-Warner, as we mentioned before, you represent, your district covers Northeast Portland, Parkrose, and some other communities. I want to get the legislative perspective from you. So we've seen tax initiatives draw significant spending in recent years, obviously Measure 97, and the grocers are largely bankrolling, like I discussed the Yes campaign this time, and they told our reporter at the Oregonian who covers business, Mike Rogaway, that they're pushing this ban so they don't have to fight another battle like that in the future because Measure 97 was so expensive. And as a state lawmaker, what is the main reason that you are opposing this initiative?
Thanks, Hillary. I think that the grocers' answer to that is quite revealing because indeed, I would argue that they are indeed pushing 103 to save themselves some money in the future. But the way they are doing that, speaking of unintended or less noticed parts of this ballot measure, another part of this ballot measure basically says that going forward, and it will put this again in the Constitution, very hard to change, It will make it so that all grocers will have their corporate minimum tax frozen at the level that it is now, and regardless of any increases, changes in how we do corporate taxation in this state, the grocers will be guaranteed to maintain the low corporate minimum that they now pay. That is the investment that they are making in their own future. They are not entirely funding this. They paid to get the signatures, they paid to put it on the ballot. They're doing a very expansive campaign at grocery stores in support of this. It is not out of the goodness of their own hearts to protect those poor little consumers, because they don't want them to pay taxes on their groceries, because as we've discussed, there's none being proposed. There's none being proposed. It is indeed an investment in their own future. They are trying to put into the Constitution a guarantee that will keep their corporate tax rates as low as possible into the foreseeable future. This is part of national language that they're pushing at different states around the country.
Well, so to explore that just a little bit more, another thing that I picked up from the reporting of our business reporter was that these grocers in general, we're talking about pretty large companies like Kroger. They are paying more than the corporate minimum tax. And I'm wondering if you can give any examples of someone who's small enough. My question to you is this hypothetical, or are there real grocery companies that have such small sales that they can pay the corporate minimum?
But one of the fascinating things to me is how anytime you talk, I don't care who you talk about groceries, and what's the first people say? Oh, well, they have really low margins, like they are this tough, challenging, poor little businesses who need all the help they can get. They are large corporate entities, yet through good use of the tax laws, many of them indeed do pay a corporate minimum that is based on sales in this state. If you manage through the corporate tax structure to not qualify to pay any taxes, you do have to pay a minimum that is based on your sales in the state. That is already the law. That is already how we do the corporate minimum here. And because of that, that is always kind of the goal, is to do the minimum. And this would just make sure that we're having some serious conversations about corporate tax reform, both through the Joint Committee on Student Success, both the House and Senate Revenue Committees. It is an ongoing conversation that I hope we will resolve in 2019. And if this passes, the grocers will just be written right out of that. They will get to write their own
and Representative, to get back to what we were talking about on the amount of sales that these companies have. So when we're talking about grocers, we're talking about a kind of business that has a large amount of, like you mentioned, low margin sales. It was a talking point from the Measure 97 election, right? So you're saying that there are ways that somehow they manipulate around the fact that they have so many sales, that the minimum tax, the corporate minimum tax in Oregon, is calculated based on your sales. It is like advocates of Measure 97 said 2 years ago, it is the gross receipts tax that we already have. Are there's ways that they're getting around that now?
No, but just what this will do is it will guarantee that will be the only way that they will pay. That will be how they will pay their corporate taxes. If whether we increase that, decrease that, change the structure, they will be guaranteed to stay at that corporate minimum. Because the way that businesses do it now, you do your federal corporate taxes, and then you pay a percentage based on the percentage of your sales nationally that come out of the state. If if you manage to either make that below the corporate minimum or whatever it is, then you move to the corporate minimum. And this would guarantee that was how the grocers are able to do it going forward, even if we change anything else about the way we do corporate taxes.
Okay. Well, and I was told to not be worried about getting too wonky, so hopefully we're not straying too much into the weeds here for our listeners. I asked the question. So, Christina, I'd like to turn back to you and talk a little bit about food and food retailers. Do they deserve any exemptions from business taxes? And feel free to distinguish between food and soda and sugary beverages here.
So I think the point of your question is, could you reframe your question in a different way?
Sure.
I'm not sure I understand how to answer it quite well enough.
Yeah, so at issue here is an initiative that would exempt companies that sell food, whether it's grocers or restaurants or other entities, companies that sell food, they'd be exempted from, or basically the state and local governments couldn't put taxes on them in Oregon in the future and couldn't raise their taxes. So should there be any exemptions from taxation of food in Oregon?
Well, I think the best way to answer that is actually to talk about whether or not all food is created equal, and whether or not whether this initiative actually even addresses what the problems are in Oregon. Food insecurity is a huge challenge here. There are lots of people that are going hungry, and unfortunately, although you would be led to believe that Constitutional Amendment 103 would do something to fix that, it actually distracts from the problem that people may vote for this thinking that suddenly people who are food insecure are not going to be anymore, when nothing about this constitutional amendment changes the nature of how people who are food insecure receive food, which is why actually we've had a lot of luck talking to people who their entire mission is around food security. And as we learn more and more the research about what it means to be a healthy person and how we stay active and the food that we use as fuel to keep ourselves healthy, the more important it is to maintain the ability to have dialogue, both at the state and the local level, to talk about what our priorities are as a community.
So are you kind of going towards the point that there should be exemptions, certain food that's healthy should not be taxed, and food that's unhealthy should be taxed?
Well, I'm not sure that Constitutional Amendment 103 actually addresses that. As in terms of this language, all food is food. So in terms of what we're talking about right now, I mean, the Heart Association would never be supportive of a tax on vegetables or fruit or things that we know that are providing important nutrition to help keep people healthy.
Okay. Interesting. So next I'd like to turn to Elizabeth. Like we talked about, Measure 103 is, or at least the supporters of Measure 103 have said that it resulted from Measure 97. And now Measure 103 supporters don't feel that they even have to show up today to this forum, which could suggest that they think that they have a lot of political support. So I'm wondering from the perspective of the coalition that's opposing Measure 103, and a lot of your members were supporters and actually got Measure 97 on the ballot. Was Measure 97 a calculation since it led us to where we are today?
Well, I think the first thing that I would point out is that the coalition that we have opposing 103 is quite different from the coalition that we had in favor of 97. We have folks opposing 103 that were on opposite sides of that argument that have then now come together to oppose 103. And that's really because it's such a flawed measure. And, you know, I would also add that the proponents of this measure like to talk a lot about Measure 97 as a reason to vote for Measure 103, rather than talking about or even agreeing on what their actual measure does.
Okay, thanks. Representative Smith-Warner, so going back to the legislature, the fact that we've got these attempts that are following each other pretty quickly, Measure 97 and then Measure 103 from opposite ends of the, well, not opposite ends of the political spectrum, but businesses and some groups that were interested a couple years ago in passing a gross receipts tax. What does that say about Oregon's legislature and apparently an inability so far to do real tax reform? There's a lot of agreement among Democrats and some Republicans that we need more revenue, but we haven't been able to do it.
You're right. It's an extremely challenging thing. I mean, Oregon has shown itself, much like many other parts of this country, to be tax averse. There is too often a lack of connection between taxes and revenue sources and the services that they pay for. And so that is a lot of what I, try to do in my work, is to draw that connection between what sources of revenue and the services that we provide: education, public safety, care for seniors, supporting childcare, working families, all of that. We can't do that without the resources that taxes do. And it's interesting, though, that the supporters of Constitutional Amendment 103 are trying to short circuit that. That conversation that is a conversation we've had going forward. It is challenging because there's a lot of voices, and because we have this supermajority requirement on taxes in the legislature.
And it's in the Constitution.
And it is in the Constitution, indeed. It makes it easy for, one or two people to keep a useful, productive conversation from going forward.
Okay, sorry, I just have to interrupt for a moment because I have to do a reminder about our broadcast for our radio audience. This is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Hillary Borrud, politics and state government reporter at the Oregonian, and with me today are Representative Barbara Smith-Warner, who we were just speaking with, Christina Bottomer from the the American Heart Association, and Elizabeth Swartow from the Coalition Campaign Against Measure 103.
I think what this demonstrates is there's a couple of ballot measures this year, but this is, so the legislature is addressing this. We are moving forward actively on some resolution, and I think that everybody, specific business entities, are trying to carve their way out of that by putting big tax loopholes for themselves into the Constitution. So, okay, we already have the supermajority requirement in it. Now with Constitutional Amendment 103, let's try to carve out and guarantee that we will only have to pay a very low corporate minimum tax going forward, so that we have ours and won't have to worry about that in the future. It's a lot cheaper on the whole for them they have decided that this is a cheap, efficient way to carve themselves out an enormous tax loophole by doing a ballot measure, by making it a constitutional amendment, rather than engaging in conversation and figuring out ways that we can share, responsibility for the resources that we want to bring into the state so that we can continue to deliver the services that Oregonians need.
Well, and that's set the table for the discussion that you're looking forward to next year, and I know that ties in with the Student Success Committee that you're on, because it's looking at what needs Oregon has or options to improve our education system, but you're going to be asking for money for that, I imagine. So shifting back to Elizabeth, so looking at next year, who will still be around who could participate in a tax reform discussion and wouldn't have been taken out of the game for paying this tax increase that we could see. The coalition that's opposing Measure 103 includes some strange bedfellows, and Nike is one of them, public employee unions throughout Oregon. And I'm wondering, Nike had been able to get a special tax deal for itself a few years ago. I'm wondering if that raises an issue that they're now coming and saying they want the grocers and these food companies not to be exempted.
Well, I certainly can't speak for Nike, but I can say the way that good public policy is made and the way that good public policy is not made. And good public policy is made in the legislature with a broad coalition of stakeholders at the table, be it the Northwest Groceries Association behind Measure 103, be it Nike, sitting in the same space in a transparent process. And I mean, Nike, along with our entire coalition, knows that that is the way that we achieve our revenue objectives, not by, sneaking a constitutional amendment exempting just one set of industries and then having to come back to the 2019 session and go around begging to other industries at the table.
And to be clear, there's some interesting things in the language about this. Number one, it's kind of being talked about as this, we can't have taxes on groceries. Well, first of all, besides the fact that no one is proposing that, there are a whole host of unintended consequences out of this. The way it's written, it's the whole supply chain of food. So that if you're a trucking company and part of your revenue is shipping food, you can exempt that part in the taxes that you pay. This can impact the way that we have a couple different, the way we fund Medicaid in this state, the way we fund our long-term senior care in this state. Those are both done by assessments on hospitals, health systems, senior living places, and because food is part of what they do, that may impact that part of their revenue stream may get pulled out and not taxed, so that could change it. The bottle bill, changes to the bottle bill, because that can be considered a tax on a grocery product, that would be impacted. And as I pointed out a number of times, this would lock it in. We couldn't lower it either. We couldn't raise taxes, but we also couldn't lower taxes that already exist. So there's just a lot of, it's a great kind of shorthand message that is trying to hide the really significant flaws and demonstrate once again that really legislating through measure, you end up with a lot of messy, unintended consequences that are almost impossible to change when you put them into a constitutional amendment.
Okay. And Elizabeth, I'm sorry to go back to you again, but I just have so many questions about your coalition. So you've got a lot of groups, including Nike and groups that work on social issues and stuff all together now. I'm wondering, in the past, Oregon businesses and public employee unions, in terms of just who plays some of the largest role in Oregon politics, have not been able to come together to agree on revenue reform. Do you see that is going to happen in the near future as a result of your coalition?
Well, first of all, I couldn't agree more that, business and labor unions have been on different sides in the past, and I think that really speaks to the flaws that we're seeing with Measure 103. The hope is that this sets a precedent for a new relationship, because there have been lessons learned. It seems like business can't really quite get their point across without labor. Labor can't really quite get their point across without business. And that's a conversation that is continuing. But today, what we're trying to accomplish right now is to defeat Measure 103, because if it passes, we can't even have that conversation.
Okay. Christina, I'd like to find out a little bit more about the American Heart Association's position on soda taxes, because I've read some different things about research over the years on what impact it has on public health. I've seen, I think it was the New York Times reported, for example, that some of the states in the South that have soda taxes still have some pretty bad health outcomes. Can you tell me a little bit more about the research that you guys look at?
So I'll touch briefly on this, but I think the most important thing about 103 is actually maintaining the ability to dive deeper into conversations around potential product taxes like sugar-sweetened beverage taxes and e-cigarette taxes, which this also would constitutionally prevent us from ever being able to do.
I'm sorry, one thing that I just want to go back to and expand upon that, certainly, so you're thinking e-cigarette taxes are not exempt from Measure 103 because cigarettes, marijuana, alcohol are exempt, the state would still be able to change taxes on them. So why are you seeing e-cigarettes?
So the current concern is actually around how 103 was written. They refer to tobacco, marijuana, and alcohol as being exempt, but then they go on to define what tobacco is and do not include an e-cigarette in that definition. So at the very best, it will be a legal fight of whether or not e-cigarettes will be included or constitutionally prevented from ever being taxed. And even with a sliver of hope, what we know about working with the tobacco industry is that will become a very expensive legal battle in and of itself, because if there is a chance that they can be included and excluded from ever being taxed, they will go for it. So having a concern around language being written of whether or not e-cigarette taxes, and it's our belief that they are not included in the carve-out for tobacco, and that's of huge concern because e-cigarettes are kind of like the new frontier of tobacco products. The FDA actually released a statement last week with a warning note to all of the largest creators of e-cigarettes because they have seen over 2 million teenagers start to use e-cigarettes in the last year because they do not consider it the same level of harm as a traditional cigarette, which is very concerning because the levels of nicotine in e-cigarettes are sometimes higher than they are in a traditional cigarette. And it's very concerning because a teenager's brain is exceptionally susceptible to addiction, which is exactly, nicotine is the part of a cigarette that is the addictive part. So that is another very large concern for us.
Yeah, clearly a large concern for you guys. So I wanted to still hear a little bit more about soda taxes and what research you're looking at that shows that that's really a good public policy tool.
So when you look at some of the soda taxes that have recently been, had great public dialogue around the importance of not only just reducing consumption, but also funding important public health programs and important community programs in the community where they've passed. Berkeley is actually the part that they have the best data from. It passed an excise tax of 2 cents per ounce, and they've been able to fund a lot of public health education and SNAP kind of incentive programs to get more fruits and vegetables into the most food insecure individuals. And in that particular study, which we have the most data about because it has passed long enough to actually have collected data, not just anecdotal data that you may have seen from the industry trying to show that these don't work, is that it can reduce consumption of sugar-sweetened beverage and increase sales of water, which is the ideal situation of getting people to make the healthy choice, the easy choice, which is kind of what a sugar-sweetened beverage excise tax can at least open the dialogue around, making sure people understand. And really, Constitutional 103 just takes that off the table of having that important dialogue at community levels around public health and around what different products can do and what they may or may not be providing for your body.
Okay, and I wanted to get to an issue that I probably could ask any one of you about, but equity is really important in this discussion, and so Elizabeth, do you mind addressing a little bit about how, if food taxes and soda taxes are being paid by people across the income spectrum, it's not like our progressive income tax system. So how do you ensure that those of us who are making the least aren't paying a greater portion of our income for those taxes?
You know, I think what I would really say to all of the families out there struggling with food insecurity in our state is I'm sorry that we have to spend so much time, resources, and energy as a coalition trying to defeat something that does absolutely nothing for you, rather than having the opportunity to do something proactive that actually serves our communities when it comes to, yes, addressing food insecurity, housing, fully funding schools.
Okay, so at this time, we do need to go to the City Club's committee report on Measure 103. We'll go and so we're going to hear from Derek Bradley, a member of the City Club Research Committee that looked into Measure 103.
Hello. Hello, my name is Derek Bradley. I was the chief author of the City Club report on this measure. Thank you all for being here to talk about an important measure on the ballot this year. As you just heard, Measure 103 proposes an amendment to the Oregon Constitution that would ban any changes to taxes, assessments, or fees related to the sale or distribution of groceries. The panelists today have discussed their perspectives on the issues and why they oppose Measure 103. Now I'd like to share our City Club Research Committee's process and what we found during our research into the issue. For your reference, you can read this and any of City Club's research reports at pdxcityclub.org. This summer, I was part of a 6-person committee that included Sarah Friedman, Lindsay Klempendren, Robin Johnson, Alex Kerr, and Ken Rosenberg. We met almost every week and had long, thoughtful discussions about the issues at play with this measure. We also talked to a lot of people with a particular point of view on this issue. Our committee sought a diverse range of opinions and expertise in our witnesses and found experts and advocates with business interests, economic expertise, public health expertise, and public service goals. Additionally, we undertook significant independent research. As a committee, we read through dozens of articles, websites, and research reports. As our committee researched and discussed what we learned, we began to focus our analysis on 6 issues. The benefits and problems that arise from this being a constitutional amendment instead of a standard statewide initiative, the preemption of local governments to best manage their communities, the complexity of the measure, the need or lack of need to pass this preventative measure, the potential impact this amendment could have on state revenue, and concerns regarding the regressive nature of a future grocery tax. We also looked at City Club research precedents as a guide. In evaluating the potential taxes, grocery tax, sweetened beverage tax, gross receipts tax, discussed in this report, the committee considered a variety of factors utilized by previous City Club reports, including the fairness of the proposed tax, specifically the progressive versus regressive nature of the proposal, the level of revenue generated, the ease with which a tax might be changed or interpreted in the future, how understandable and clear the tax was, and the efficiency and simplicity of collecting the tax. After analyzing the measure, hearing testimony from both sides, and reviewing available literature, we have concluded that Measure 103 has the potential to create significant administrative and legal problems in the state. The main issue we found is that it is not clear what is covered by this measure, and that the measure would likely increase administrative costs for collecting taxes from businesses unrelated to the sale of groceries, but still covered by this measure, including hospitals and trucking companies. In addition, there appears to be no significant threat of a tax on basic groceries such as bread or produce. The most significant tax threat is to sugar-sweetened beverages, which are not commonly thought of as groceries. As a result, this committee recommends a no vote on Measure 103. 96% of the City Club's members who voted in August agreed with our approach and voted to adopt the research. Thank you to City Club, the Research Board, the Board of Governors, and all of our fellow members for enabling us to do this research and for your support along the way.
So now we're going to turn to you, our audience, for some questions. And everyone who's watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on one of those index cards, hold it high for City Club staff to collect. And you may also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. So hashtag FridayForum. To City Club members who'd like to ask a question to the mic, please identify yourself as a member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less.
I've noticed that a number of the grocers have started to put out literature for the Yes campaign. My question is that do they have any obligation to, as a public place, to actually offer literature from the No campaign?
Elizabeth, you look like you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I want to respond to that one. I'm really sorry that the Yes campaign is using our local grocery stores as a tool to fearmonger voters into voting yes on their measure. But at the end of the day, voters are just not going to pay that much more attention to a leaflet on Yes on 103 than a coupon. Maybe even a little bit more attention to a coupon, because that'll actually save them money on groceries, unlike Measure 103.
And I would just say, I doubt they have an obligation because it's their place of business and they get to control, like on the outside possibly, but everything that I've seen has been inside at the check-in counters, at the self-checks. So I doubt they would have an obligation, but.
Ted K, City Club member. Do you have any sense of how much money has been raised for the yes side and how much money has been raised for the no side?
Ooh, I have to plead to not having checked that before I came here this morning. I know it took a couple million for the grocers and others to get this on the ballot.
I think they spent about $7 million.
Elizabeth, you probably know this.
Couple million on both sides.
I am Bobby Regan, City Club member. A few years back, I was asked to work on the Measure 98 campaign, statewide campaign to improve high school graduation rates. And the first question I asked of the campaign was, is this a statutory measure or is this a constitutional amendment? I would not have worked on the campaign if it had been a constitutional amendment, because I believe it's important for the legislature to have the opportunity to make changes over time when a citizen initiative is passed. So could some of you talk a little bit about the differences, why the grocers chose to do this as a constitutional amendment, what opportunity the legislature will have over time to make adjustments if needed? Because I think that's a point that a lot of citizens don't, or a lot of our neighbors don't necessarily understand.
Yeah, it's interesting, just on the face of it, the difference between qualifying a constitutional amendment versus a statutory is the number of signatures that you have to gather. And the number is higher for a constitutional amendment. Structurally, it is significant because a constitutional amendment can only be changed. The session after it is passed, the legislature could try to change and then would have to send it back for a vote again. That would be the only opportunity. And this is a significant thing. Oregon voters are pretty savvy when it comes to their ballot measures. A number of years ago, there was a tobacco tax introduced that everybody thought was a great idea, except that its proponents made it into a constitutional amendment instead, and there was backlash against that, and it was defeated in no small part because of being a constitutional amendment and people understanding the difference in that. So I would argue that just because there is a lot of inappropriate things in our Constitution does not mean that we should put in one more by passing this. So I would argue that the idea of, again, putting this permanent tax loophole for one swath of businesses into our Constitution is the wrong thing to do. And as I mentioned briefly before, this is language that is being shopped all around the country. This is part of a national effort that the grocers are trying to do to exempt themselves from taxing opportunities in states around the country, and we are the first place that they have gotten this far on. So this is not something that is being done out of the good of their hearts. There's no proposals to do this. It's a poorly written, bad idea that has no place in our Constitution.
Any more questions out there? All right, well, if there aren't any more questions, then I think, Colin, would you like to join us?
Sorry, I always forget that there aren't stairs on this side of the stage. So we will pause the discussion for now. If everyone could join me in thanking all of our panelists and Hillary as our moderator. And thank you to Andrew Kollick and the Friday Forum Committee for producing today's program. Thank you.